Okay, so a very good morning to everybody who's watching this video. This little tour is of Pall Mall and the Mall and a couple of little surrounding areas as well. So, without any further waiting, we'll just dive right in. Sure, let's go for this wonderful share screen and play it from the beginning. Good old technology. I'm just going to move my camera up here to the top right, so don't block any of the images. Today's tour, whatever time of the day you're watching this, is on Pall Mall and the Mall, one of my favourite places to guide people around London. Just because it's full of history, development, and it's so handy to everything around the city. You've got the famous West End of London, within walking distance at the top end of Piccadilly. And yeah, you're not too far away from the River Thames, about 10-minute walk from here as well. You got Whitehall and all the sort of Parliament areas as well. So we're going to concentrate on Pall Mall and the Mall this evening. So we're going to have a little look at the history of Pall Mall. We'll check out some hidden gems around the area. It's always a good idea, especially in these nice areas, just to go down the little side streets and see where you come out at, especially in the area of St Jamesits. It's really safe but really fun to go exploring. And we'll have a little look at what it's famous for. Pall Mall is also known as Clubland because these private members' clubs, as they're now known, they used to be referred to as gentlemen's clubs. And then we'll have a little look as through the evening at royalty as well. Big reason for the way that Pall Mall developed had to do with the royals from the sort of Tudor period into the Stuart dynasty as well. So, as always, just to get our bearings then before we set off, we've got the River Thames over to the right hand side of your map. Then you've got this large green area with a body of water in it, which is St James's Park, and that leads you up to Buckingham Palace. So the road just here is the Mall, which goes from Buckingham Palace to Admiralty Arch. And then parallel to that, we have Pall Mall and then the area of St James's. This piece of green to the left side of your map is now known as Green Park because it's a park and it's very, very green. They're wonderful at naming places here in London. Don't even want the locals to get lost. That used to, you'll see later on, that used to actually be part of Green Park before Buckingham Palace was built. So this is the general area we're going to be focusing on: the Mall, Pall Mall, around St James's, bit of Trafalgar Square as well. Just to begin with, so if you don't know me, I've been a tour guide in London since 2016. And when I first came to London, moved here and got a job, I was originally guiding on open top tour buses. You know the kind, they're in most major cities around the world. So the nice thing was, I live in Pimlico, which is by the River Thames. And so I used to walk up to work when we started off around Piccadilly. And I used to have my breakfast every morning on that little bench, which was really nice, just overlooking the lake here and then Pelican Rocks to the right hand side, where you can find the pelicans when they're there, a few swans and so on. So this is St James's Park. They get ready for the new season. They're out planting their new flowers, the royal gardeners, and laying down the new grass, the lawn here as well. It always looks wonderful, especially for the gardeners amongst you. And here we have Trafalgar Square, which is a really good starting point for many tours around London and Pall Mall. So Trafalgar Square was named after the guy who we can't quite see. We'll see him later on. He's at the top of this column, uh, who is Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson. So he fought in what was known as the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Well, most he was in the Revolutionary Wars. The name changes later on. Trafalgar was his final victory because he would lose his life in that same battle. He won the victory on the 21st of October 1805. But then he was shot by a French sniper whilst he was standing on board his flagship, the HMS Victory. So when he was brought back to London and buried, then a few years later, plans put in motion to lay out this park. So in 18 or square. So in 1842, it was laid out in this fashion. Hadn't changed too much. The front of the National Gallery at the back had been pedestrianised, but other than that, it's pretty similar. The National Gallery is a great place to visit. Once we come out of our lockdown period, May 17th, hopefully the galleries and museums get to reopen. It's free to go into. They may implement their way of ticketing, which was to get a time slot, but it's free. You just go online at nationalgallery.org. And yeah, it's wonderful. It's all about Western European art, primarily. There's, I think, one painting by an American artist, but for the most part, it's from the 13th century up until the beginning of the 20th century. You go right through the Renaissance period, Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci. Then you go into the Northern Renaissance with people like Johann van Eyck. Then you go right through, you've got Rococo in there. You've got the famous English artists such as Turner and Constable, and then it goes up until Impressionism of Seurat, Monet, and Vincent van Gogh, Gough, Hoche, however you wish to pronounce his name. So, really good place to go. And if you're looking for afternoon tea, they've got a wonderful cafe at the very top of the building. So, just a bit on the name then. So Pall Mall derives from an Italian bat and ball game, Palle Mallie, which derives from the Latin palla, meaning ball, malleus, meaning maul, a hammer or a mallet. So basically, it was a precursor for croquet. And one king who loved this sport, this game, was this gentleman here, who is King Charles II. So Charles II was in exile in France when his father lost the English Civil War. In 1649, his father was beheaded in London on Whitehall. And Charles II was exiled, but he loved this game, picked it up in France. And then when he eventually came back to Scotland, made king there, and then he was invited to be the King of England again, he started playing this game out the front of his palace, just here. So this is St James's Palace. So the royals and aristocracy and all would have been seeing him playing this game, but he got really annoyed at the amount of traffic that was interrupting his game. So he decided to expand it down to the Mall, which is why we pronounce these words instead of mall, like be a very American term, but a lot of us are familiar with that pronunciation. We say Mall because of Palle Mallie, the Italian bat and ball game. So, the development of St James's and Pall Mall. Many of the wealthy were starting to move out of the city of London by the 17th century. The Great Fire of London expedited that as well, but areas were being developed before the Great Fire. Covent Garden was being developed by Inigo Jones, and this area of St James's was all owned by Charles I here. So he would give out leaseholds. So a good friend of his wife, who is Henrietta Maria, was this gentleman who's the first Earl of St Albans, Henry German, spelled Jermyn. So there's German Street and stuff named after him in St James's area. So he started to develop the land, and this wonderful map then sort of shows it. This was made in 1683, this map. So here we have what is St James's Park today, and then St James Park wrapped around the palace here, St James Palace, and then this is St James Park as well. Buckingham Palace had not been built yet. Goring House was on the site, which was owned by Charles I, and then it would be bought by the Duke of Buckingham in 1702 and sort of rebuilt as Buckingham House. We'll just zoom in a little bit here. So we're going to concentrate on Pall Mall here, which is known there as Pall Mall Street. And then we'll have a look at the square here as well, St James's Square. Go up into a couple of little hidden areas as well. And if we go back a second, this area is Trafalgar Square. So this is Whitehall. There's a huge palace the whole length of this area, the Palace of Whitehall. And that's why this is called the Royal Mews. So this is the stable yard of Henry VIII then. And so Trafalgar Square in the 17th century, not a thing. Okay. And Right. So, like I said, good place to start, Trafalgar Square. Then we're going to walk east to west down Pall Mall. Here we can see Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson at the very top of his column. You got National Gallery, and then the little church here is St Martin's in the Fields, which there's been a church on this site since the 1200s when this was a tiny little village known as Charing, and it's where we get the name Charing Cross for one of our railway stations. We go around the corner, you've got the National Gallery in the bottom with the photo in the centre here. But you'll see lots of statues of kings and queens around this area because of its link to Buckingham Palace, St James's Palace, etc. This gentleman is King George III. So his son, George IV, Georgie Porgy Pudding and Pie, he was the guy that really developed Buckingham House to be a palace for the royals. George III was known as the Mad King because he lost most of his mental faculties later in life. And this was actually due to a blood disorder called porphyria. And he was the last king of the 13 American colonies before the Americans colonists revolted and had their War of Independence. And then, with the signing of the Paris Treaty, the United States was born in 1783. The house or the building to the right is known as Oceanic House. So, Oceanic House, it has a big link to Belfast, and I know many of my audience are from Northern Ireland. This was the headquarters of a shipping company called the White Star Line. And most of us will go, right, okay. So they were the company that commissioned the building of Titanic in Belfast. And after that great tragedy in April of 1912, they didn't recover, so they folded here. The building was renovated back in 2016 again, and they're trying to lease it out as office space down below. Another king, he's a Norwegian king. This is actually just opposite King George III in Norway House, the old Norwegian embassy. His name is King Olaf. So King Olaf ruled the Orkney Islands, and because the Vikings had multiple settlements throughout Britain from about the 800s up until the 11th century. So he was Norwegian. Another Danish Viking that was attacking London was called Canute. And King Olaf here went to the aid of the Saxon king Ethelred II and helped him pull down London Bridge to prevent the Danes from crossing the bridge to attack London. So that's why you'll get many churches throughout England called Saint Olaf, because he was made a saint after his death. Great little pub. I'm sure a few of you have gone into this pub before. There's the Admiralty on Trafalgar Square. It's fantastic little pub. Really good food as well. If you go into the pub, make sure you go down into the old cellars downstairs. If it's not being used for a private function, it's another dining area, but it's got the old cellars and the arches and things like that. Really atmospheric. Really nice pub. So we'll carry on down Pall Mall then. If you look up on the map, you see our placement here. So we're just looking at the Royal Opera Arcade. This is the very first shopping arcade to be built in Britain. So an arcade is simply a line of shops either side of the street, but then covered over with a solid roof. And this is a beautiful one. It's got a couple of art galleries. It's the back entrance to New Zealand House, the New Zealand High Commission, which would be on the right side of this building. Little wine bar about halfway down, and a beautiful little coffee shop at the very end. A nice little beer shop as well for sort of all sorts of weird and wonderful beers on the other side on King Charles I Street. Right, so Clubland. This is what Pall Mall is sort of known for, the private clubs. So when these were established, many of them in the early 1800s, they were for the aristocracy primarily, and they would have their own rules and regulations of how you can join. This one was slightly different, but it would be for officers. Um, when it originally opened, this is the British Army's officers' private club, where Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was a member, the victor at the Battle of Waterloo, which brought to an end the Napoleonic Wars back in 1815. He went on to become Prime Minister, and he was the Constable of the Tower of London, things like that. 1903, then a new club moves into this building known as the IOD, the Institute of Directors. So I said each of the clubs has their own sort of uh, rules and regulations of how you can join, what criteria you have to have, and so on. So for the IOD, you have to obviously be linked to the business world. Okay. You can't just apply on your own. You have to be sponsored. So this is all about who you know, networking, and so on. So that's the IOD. Just around the corner is the wonderful Athenaeum Club, set up in 1832, I think, 1834. And this was for the intellectuals. So people like Charles Dickens, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the Cubitt brothers, who I talked about in my first tour, the great architects of Victorian London. They were here as well. And let's see. Oh, uh, here's where a term comes from. You might be familiar with this term, to be blackballed. So to be blackballed means that you're not allowed entrance into establishment. You're put on a list. And the reason for this is I mentioned that you have to be sponsored to join these clubs. So you would go in, you would have your friend who's already a member, then your friend would put forward your name for new membership. That would have to be seconded by a second member. Then each of the members would meet you, and they all get given a white or a black billiard ball, like a snooker ball or a pool ball. And they would get a white or black one, anonymously put it into a sack. Then, when everybody had voted, when the sack is put out over the table, and if there was one single black ball amongst all the white ones, that was it. You weren't getting membership. So that's where black ball comes from. This famously happened to British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. He tried to join the club before he was Prime Minister, was unsuccessful. And then when he became Victoria's, one of her favourite Prime Ministers, funnily enough, he got accepted the second time he tried to join in. So, yeah. The Athenaeum Club takes its name from Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Her golden statue just above the doorway. I know it's pretty small. I should have got a closer photo for you guys. It's something you can have a look at when you come to London to visit. So Athena was a goddess of wisdom for the Athenians and the Greeks. That's where they took their name from, Athens. And they in Athens have what is known as the Acropolis, which many of their courts were on, this beautiful hilltop. And at the very top, you had the Parthenon. Around the Parthenon, you had the friezes that you can see if you visit the British Museum, sometimes referred to as the Elgin Marbles, by the guy who brought them to Britain. A little bit of controversy there, the Greeks asking for them back and so on and so forth, but that's for the Greeks and the British Museum to decide. But around the top of the Athenaeum, you have this frieze here, which is a perfect representation of what would have been wrapped around the Parthenon itself. So that's pretty cool as well. Nice little link here. And it's a nice building. If you're a fan of the Crown TV series, I think they use this for the Princess Theatre in one of the series starring Olivia Colman. And just behind the Athenaeum Club, we have the Travelers Club, along with the beautiful flower pots here. So the Travelers Club initially was their criteria was that you had to travel a minimum of 500 miles away from the front door here. Then someone went ahead and invented the aeroplane, so that rule went out the window. And basically, it's turned into sort of, not exclusively, but an ambassadors club. So if you're an ambassador, um, if you're a British ambassador to other countries, you get membership. But if you're ambassadors from other countries to Britain, you would normally be given membership as well if you wanted it. Next to the Travelers Club is this building, the Reform Club, established in 1836 for the Radicals and the Whigs. Whigs spelled Whigs. They had successfully got the Reform Act passed in 1832, and they wanted a building of their own to sort of come together and share ideas and so on. Then the Liberal Party would use this as their headquarters when they were established. It is now politically neutral. It's not unusual for political parties to have private clubs like this one. The Conservatives, for example, are in the Carlton Club because their original headquarters was Carlton House Terrace, just behind these buildings. Now Carlton Club is located on St Jamesits Street. This doorway is famous because of a writer called Jules Verne. He published a novel called Around the World in 80 Days. So this is where Phineas Fogg and the gentleman were making the bets that he couldn't do it. Michael Palin then recreated that wonderful journey in one of his great travel documentaries. Michael Palin from Monty Python, he's a famous comedian. And funnily enough, when he did his entire circumnavigation of the globe and then gets back to the doorway, they don't let him in. They refuse him entry simply because he was not wearing a tie and necktie. He had to be properly dressed. I think the dress goes slightly relaxed nowadays. But he kept it in the documentary if you have a little look at it. So that's the Reform Club. Moving down the street, we have the one for the motor enthusiast. This is the RAC, the Royal Automobile Club. So this was established in the early 20th century as a sort of temple to the automobile. And then to join this one, again, you have to know people. And typically, you're going to have some sort of background in motorsports, engineering, design, sponsors of teams, that type of thing. So yeah, wonderful building, one of the largest clubs on the Pall Mall itself. And one of the last clubs then, we have the Oxford Cambridge University Club here. So this is number 73 Pall Mall, and it's basically, yeah, you just have to graduate from one of the many universities at Oxford or Cambridge, and then you can go on a list here. That's how you would join this one. But it's all about networking. And like I said, initially they were known as gentlemen's clubs, but then 2006, most of them got their act together. So women were able to become full members rather than just going in with a member as well. There's one club, I think, that is left that is known as Whites. I think it is still a gentlemen's only club. It's where the royals would be members: Prince William, Charles, Philip, and David Cameron. His father were members. I think they got rid of their membership when they wouldn't allow women to join. Um, I still think they go there, but these clubs as well were also known as the sort of early hotel for the aristocracy. So Downton Abbey, I love that TV show, which is why I use it quite often in referencing. But Lord Grantham, if he's traveling down to London for the day, would often say, I'll just stay at the club. I'll not open the full London house because it takes too much effort. So they would stay in rooms that they could rent from the club then. Okay, so we're going to go back up Pall Mall a bit, back to the beginning. So remember we had the IOD here, the Institute of Directors, the Athenaeum, there's Carlton House Terrace, where the Conservatives had their original headquarters, and the Royal Society here. But we're focusing on this little area of Waterloo Place because of this memorial. This is the Crimean War Memorial. The Crimean War took place in Crimea between 1853 and 1856, so during the Victorian period. The reason I'm focusing on this particular one, it's remembering the soldiers who died with these three representations of the Grenadier, the Coldstream, and the Scots Guard. And then this one, the gentleman on the right is Sidney Herbert, so he was a politician at the time of the Crimean War. The lady on the left is Florence Nightingale, the very famous nurse, and I should have got a photograph of her in profile because you can see her lamp a bit easier in her right hand here. Florence Nightingale volunteered for the British Army as a nurse. She worked at the front lines. She carried around her oil lamp, which where she got the nickname from the soldiers from. She was Italian, and when the Crimean War ended, she didn't return back to Britain. She went off to Constantinople for a number of years, modern day Istanbul. She continued working as a nurse, and then she would come back to London. Now, she had contracted something called Crimean fever, which pretty much made her bedbound for most of the time. But even though she was bedbound, she still managed to set up the very first teaching hospital in London for nurses to train nurses professionally for the first time. And she also implemented a couple of rules. Okay, so rule number one was this: that all doctors and nurses should now start washing their hands before they treat a patient. Bit of hygiene. Excellent rule. Rule number two, however, that no doctor or nurse should be under the influence of alcohol or opiates whilst operating on a patient. Even better rule. In fact, the introduction of these two rules saw your chances of survival rise amazingly by around 70% at St Thomas's Hospital. So well done, Florence. She was also the first woman to join the Order of Statisticians, and she developed what we now refer to as the pie chart. There was a previous type known as the rose chart, but then the pie chart really took off. So off the beaten path just a little bit. Um, so we have this wonderful square here marked on your map with a red dot. This is St James's Square. Lovely little area to go and explore. Um, and in the centre of it is another king, known to a lot of people in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, King William the Fourth. So William the Fourth here was the only co-monarch in British history. His wife, Mary II, also held rank as monarch, and they ruled equally. And basically, he was the son-in-law of James II. So Mary was James II's daughter. James II was Catholic. William here was Protestant, so the English wanted a Protestant on the throne. So they asked for, William to come across, and then they have what they call the Glorious Revolution, and then James sort of gave in and went into exile then. This little square, you get a lot of headquarter company Rolex is over here on the left hand side. Just behind us, where I take the photograph from, is the headquarters of British Petroleum. The wonderful London Library is in the corner here as well. So lots of nice benches, really nice little part of London to get away from the main busy streets. Okay, so just around the corner, you have to go down a couple of alleyways here, which I always like taking guests down, and then they're like, oh, they're not too sure about it, but then they see this lovely courtyard here, Mason's Yard, it is known as. And I would normally stand them in front as we're looking at the photograph now. We're looking at this unassuming building, number 13, Mason's Yard, which was a private club. But this was not for aristocracy. This was for the rock and rollers, because they couldn't get into all those big fancy clubs. So they set up their own one. Paparazzi never came here. There was sort of an agreement, because paparazzi used to work with the managers of the bands, to get their photographs. So it was sort of unwritten rule they wouldn't ever come here. It was just for the rock and roll stars. And I'll tell you a little story about a guy called Chaz Chandler. Now, Chaz was the bassist of a band known as the Animals, okay, House of the Rising Sun, one of their big hits. But whenever the Beatles came along and they were, having their Beatlemania in America and everything, Chaz realized that the Animals weren't, doing so many gigs now. So he went, took a sidestep and basically became a manager. So he set up a company in London. A good friend of Chaz was called Linda Keith, who was going out with Keith Richards at the time of the Rolling Stones. And Linda was in New York City in Greenwich Village, and she was in a venue listening to this kid play guitar, and she couldn't believe how well he was playing. So she phones up her friend Chaz and said, "There's this kid here. You got to come over and listen to him. You got to sign him, get him back to England. He's wonderful." So Chaz like, "Really? Is he that good?" Like, "Yeah, go for it. Come on." So he flies across. He listened to the kid playing at the same venue, and he just like, right, okay, this guy's a star. So he talks to the kid and says, "Look, you're very, very polished. You know what you're doing. You must be a part of a band or someone. Why haven't I heard of you?" Like, you haven't heard of me because yes, I used to be part of a band, but the band was called the Little Richard Band, and the only star in the Little Richard Band was Little Richard. So I eventually got the sack, which is why I'm here. And Giles was like, "Oh, okay. Well, if you're not working with anybody, sure, why don't you come sign with me and we'll head back to London. And I know all the guys there, so we'll get set up really easily." So the kid's like, "Yeah, okay, but I've never left America before, so I don't have a passport." Child's like, it's the 1960s. We'll get your passport next week. So they do, and they arrive back. And he doesn't have a work permit yet, so the kid can't play commercially. He can't play for money just yet. But Charles brings him down here to the Scotch of St James's, and it goes in where like everybody used to hang out here. Eric Clapton was one of the most regular people here. You know, you had members of the Who, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. They would all drink here. So it was a pretty tough crowd if you're bringing a new kid in. So Charles comes in. Eric is playing on the little stage, and Charles asks Eric, you know, can this kid sort of play a couple of songs? And Eric's like, yeah, all right, as the legend goes. And the kid went ahead and played and blew everybody away. Now, the 23-year-old kid from Seattle I'm talking about is one Mr. Jimmy Marshall Hendricks. So, yeah, this is where he got his start in London. And of course, I did mention the Beatles then. So, this little art gallery is just opposite the Scotch of St James's. And back in the day, it used to be called the Indica. So one evening, Paul McCartney sitting there talking away with John Lennon, and he takes him across the street to try to lift his mood because John Lennon's just split up with his wife, Cynthia. So he goes across the street, and that's where he meets Yoko Ono for the very first time. And then after he gets divorced, then they obviously have their relationship, and the rest is history. So, a couple of hidden secrets then. By that, I mean, yeah, the pubs. I'm not going to go too heavy into the pubs, but basically, just a couple. So, if you walk from St James's Square, here on the map on your left, and then down King Street, you'll see, well, a very famous auction house called Christie's. Okay, this is the biggest sort of building on the opposite side. Now, if you look to the left, you'll see the Golden Lion pub. Really nice little pub. So if you get a chance, come back to London. Make sure you look it up. It's really nice. Go upstairs. You come out onto that balcony where the sign is. Really nice. But what I point out the pub for is because the building on its immediate right used to be a theatre called St James's Theatre, where Vivian Lee and Laurence Olivier used to work, and they loved this theatre. So when it was closing down, they tried to rescue it, but unsuccessfully. But if you go down the little alleyway to the side of the pub, you'll see a little carving of Vivian Lee and Laurence Olivier. So yeah, it's very, very nice. Nice little piece of hidden history. And then if you carry on down King Street and then turn left onto Crime Passage, you'll come up to this little pub called the Red Lion. The Red Lion is the most popular name of a pub in England. It all has to do with the red lions on the coat of arms of the royal family since the days of William the Conqueror and earlier, actually. So this little archway in the bottom left here, this will take us back on to Pall Mall, and you'll see what you'll look at in a second. But the pub, remember Charles the First? So he was executed on the what 30th or 31st of January 1649. So the Stuart Society, because he was Charles Stuart, his father was James the First, King of Scotland, and then England, and then so the Stuart Society every year on the anniversary of his death or around that time, it's normally a Saturday, they'll go down, they wreath of flowers by his statue on Charles the First roundabout, and then they'll come here for a little drink of sherry. And they're always dressed up in their period garb of the early 17th century. So yeah, that's the Red Lion then on Crime Passage. Then if we go through the archway and come out, we would be here, looking at the reason why St James's exists, St James's Palace. So this is a 16th century palace, and it is the most senior working palace in the United Kingdom. A lot of people assume that Buckingham Palace is because of its fame and the Queen and so on, but Buckingham Palace is a royal residence. This is a working palace. So anytime the royal family have royal engagements, it all gets processed through this palace. Anytime an ambassador receives their accreditations, it's here at the court of St James's. Anytime you want a member of the royal family to open up, say, a hospital wing or a new library, something to that effect, you would write to the court of St James's, not to Buckingham Palace. And here's one of their courtyards. This is Friary Court. And this is where the change of the guard ceremony would normally begin, with the old guard coming out and being inspected and then leading the band out, and then the soldiers behind them down towards Buckingham Palace to meet up with the rest of their regiments. And yeah, it's a great bit of history here because this palace was built as a wedding present. Okay, so built by this guy, Henry VIII, not personally, hired architects and so on. But he was going to give it as a wedding present to not his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was married for decades to, but to his second wife, his so called great love, this lady, Anne Boleyn. So Henry had separated from the church, the Roman Catholic Church, set up the Church of England, and all to marry Anne Boleyn. And he completes this palace that was going to be her wedding present a few years after they were married in 1536. That just happened to be the same year that he decides to execute Anne Boleyn. So she never got to actually see her wedding present being completed. She was charged with all sorts of things, witchcraft being one of them. Anne was actually a big fan of universal education, and she was taking money from the royal coffers to pay for various educational establishments to be set up that were going to be free. So if you take money away from the court, then the courtiers, so the aristocracy and surrounding people, wouldn't have access to it, and they didn't like that. So apparently they started whispering evil thoughts into Henry's ear, and he ended up executing her while he was playing a game of tennis down in Hampton Court. And then another resident was the guy who started off with, Charles II, the Merry Monarch. He's known as the Merry Monarch because he had a wife, Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, and then he hadn't met her before they got married, and then they got married, and he wasn't really taken with her looks, so he had no children with Catherine of Braganza. He did have many children with one of his, 25 different girlfriends he would have over the course of his lifetime. One of his famous mistresses was a lady called Nell Gwynn, this lady on the right hand side here. So she famously sold oranges at Covent Garden and then became a very famous comedic actor on the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, and caught the king's eye. And they had their liaisons. She had children, and he would move her into a house just around the corner here. And she was quite a savvy woman because she realized that if the king loses interest in her or the children, which were illegitimate, so they can do anything, although he did give them titles at her request. But one thing she wanted was financial security. So the area of Pall Mall and the Mall and St James's is Crown Estate. So that means that they lease the land out to builders, developers, and people can rent it from them. How the royals make their money. She now go in here, asked that her house, which is this one, in the centre, lovely 17th century mansion, be transferred into her name legally. And so Charles II agreed. So it became one of the only buildings on Pall Mall not to be part of the Crown Estate, even to this day. Thomas Gainsborough, the famous artist, he also lived here as well. Yeah, fair bit of a little history here. So we just stepped down onto the Mall, the Royal Mall now. So if you look at your maps, we're just actually, I've taken this photograph from just here in the corner, but the red dot indicates the building itself. This is Marlborough House. So Marlborough House was the home of the Duke of Marlborough in London residence, and it was built by Sir Christopher Wren in the early 1700s. And primarily it was paid for by Queen Anne and given to her favourite, Sarah Churchill. If you've seen the movie with Olivia Colman and I think it was Rachel Weisz, I watched it a few days ago, but it's an interesting take on the story. But yeah, Marlborough House here, and it's now the headquarters of the Commonwealth. If you just pick out the flag on the right hand side, there's a few of them here, but there's not a great strong wind, so I can't see them clearly. So this is the headquarters of the Commonwealth, and then look at the flags in alphabetical order of all the members of the Commonwealth, minus the flag of the United Kingdom. So there's about 52, 53 flags along here. But yeah, Marlborough House. And then here we're on the Mall again, the red dot. St James's Park just behind us. We're just looking down Stable Yard. This is the end of St James's Palace. And then you have Clarence House, is the white building where Prince Charles and Camilla live. And if you look down To your right, you would see Admiralty Arch, set up by Edward VII as a tribute to his mother, Queen Victoria, after her death. This came about 10 years after her death, and it was an extension of the Admiralty. So it was sort of the cabinet office for the Sea Lords of the early 20th century. Now it's being converted into a five-star hotel. And I got look at some of the blueprints. You can find them online if you type in Admiralty Arch Hotel. Just search through the maze. So these windows above the archway, it looks like they're going to make that a public restaurant. So that could be quite nice to go and have afternoon tea, because the highlight of it, the main selling point is if you're sitting here having your afternoon tea, you basically look down the Mall at Buckingham Palace. So yeah, I could imagine it's going to be popular and expensive and all that type of stuff. So yeah, it's there. We have Buckingham Palace. Hopefully, we'll see what they do this year. Obviously, they couldn't open last year because of lockdown. Normally, they open towards the end of July and August, when the Queen typically would go to Balmoral for her summer holidays. But we'll have to wait and see what the news is from the palace. Tickets are normally quite reasonable. It's about 23, £24 or so. And it's tickets like that that normally keep the upkeep of the palace, keep in condition. The east wing here, so the white part of the palace, was designed by the same gentleman who made this sculpture here, this memorial, Victoria Memorial, and Admiralty Arch as well. So that was Aston Webb, one of the chief architects for Edward VII. So there we go. So thanks very much for tuning in and listening. I do these live normally. These are just recorded ones. So whenever I do live ones, it paid ticketed. So I donate half the money to the RNIB. So I've done a couple of tours so far. So we've raised £180. So thanks very much for that. You can always follow me on Instagram at Best Walking Tours. If you like the tour, please leave a review on my Facebook page, the actual page, Best Walking Tours. It just helps me when other people come along to prove that I'm a half decent tour guide. I'm working on the website at the moment, and then next Sunday, so if you're watching this currently, next Sunday I'm doing my Rent to Rogers Architects of the City of London. So I normally post these up a few weeks after we've had the live one. The live ones are £5 for a ticket, and like I say, I donate half of it to the RNIB, the Royal National Institute for the Blind. So yes, next week's tour on Sunday, the 21st of March. No, sorry, 24th of March will be 21st of March will be Rent to Rogers, Architects of the City of London. So I'm just going to exit out of the full screen here and stop this recording. So yeah, take care, guys. Until next time, and look forward to seeing you exploring London.